Spotlight effect. You spill coffee on your shirt before a meeting. Now every glance feels like judgment. Every pause in conversation seems to confirm it. They see it. They're thinking about it. The stain becomes the only thing you can focus on, convinced it's the only thing anyone else sees. Except it isn't. Most people didn't notice. The ones who did forgot within seconds. This is the spotlight effect. It's the illusion that others are watching you far more closely than they actually are. Your mind convinces you you're on stage, lit up, with an audience tracking every flaw. But the reality is different. Everyone else is managing their own spotlight, just as convinced that others are scrutinizing them. The effect happens because of how your attention works. You live inside your own experience. Every mistake gets replayed in your head, magnified, a take to meaning. But other people don't run that same loop. They're not tracking your errors. They're too busy managing their own. Researchers tested this. Participants wore embarrassing shirts into a room full of strangers, then guessed how many people noticed. They overestimated by nearly double. To them, the shirt felt glaring. To others, it barely registered. The same pattern plays out constantly. You stumble over words in a presentation and assume everyone caught it. But most people were focused on their own thoughts, half checking their phones, waiting for their turn. You send a text with a typo and imagine the recipient judging your carelessness. They read it, understood it, moved on. The spotlight effect doesn't just create anxiety. It warps decisions. You stay silent in meetings because one awkward comment feels permanent. You skip events because one bad interaction feels defining. You edit yourself endlessly, not because others demand it, but because you believe they're watching closer than they are. Here's what shifts when you see the pattern: most people aren't tracking your flaws. They're not keeping score. The audience you imagine doesn't exist. The moments you think defined you barely registered. The spotlight was never as bright as it felt. Hostile attribution bias. Someone cuts you off in traffic. No signal. No warning. Just aggression. A coworker sends a blunt email. No greeting. No warmth. Just coldness. A friend cancels plans last minute. No real reason. Just indifference. The conclusion feels automatic. They're being hostile. Rude. Deliberate. But what if they weren't? What if the driver was rushing to an emergency, the coworker was drowning in deadlines, the friend just got bad news? The behavior looks identical. The intent behind it is completely different. This reflects reading hostility into neutral or unclear actions happens more than most people realize. It's the mind treating ambiguity as threat, filling in blanks with worst-case assumptions. And once that interpretation locks in, it drives everything that follows. The pattern has roots in survival. Humans evolved to detect danger. A rustling bush could be wind or a predator. Assuming wind and being wrong meant death. Assuming predator and being wrong just wasted energy. So the brain defaults to threat, even when the threat no longer exists. In modern life, that same system misfires constantly. A coworker's short message isn't a threat, but your brain treats it like one anyway, scanning for hidden aggression, assigning intent that was never there. The effect compounds in relationships. You interpret a partner's silence as anger when they're exhausted. You read a friend's distraction as rejection when they're overwhelmed. Each misreading adds tension. And because you're reacting to hostility you imagined, your response creates actual conflict. The other person, blindsided by your defensiveness, escalates. Now the hostility you assumed has become real. Research shows the bias strengthens after conflict or betrayal. If you've been hurt before, your mind becomes hypersensitive. A neutral face gets read as contempt. A delayed text feels like abandonment. The brain is protecting you from threats that aren't there. The pattern appears everywhere. Workplaces where feedback gets heard as attack. Friendships where a missed message becomes proof of distance. Public spaces where a stranger's glance registers as judgment. The damage is real. You respond to aggression that doesn't exist, creating friction where there was none. You pull back from people who weren't retreating. You defend against attacks that never happened. The bias doesn't just misread the present. It actively destroys the future. The instinct won't disappear. The mind will still default to threat. But recognizing it creates a gap, a moment to ask, is this actually hostile or does it just feel that way? Most of the time, the aggression isn't aimed at you. False consensus effect. Everyone thinks like you do. Or at least, that's what it feels like. Your opinions feel reasonable because they're yours. Your preferences feel normal because you hold them. Your values feel universal because they make sense to you. You assume most people would agree. They don't. This happens constantly. You hate a movie and assume most people felt the same way. You love a restaurant and can't understand why it's not packed. You think a political stance is obvious and are genuinely shocked when half the room disagrees. The world feels like it should align with your perspective. When it doesn't, it registers as strange, irrational, even wrong. This is the false consensus effect. It's the assumption that your views, habits, and reactions are more common than they actually are. Your mind uses your own experience as the baseline for normal, then projects that baseline onto everyone else. The effect works because of how you gather information. You don't have direct access to what other people think. You can't see inside their heads. So your brain fills the gap by using the one data point it does have you. If something feels obvious to you, your mind assumes it's obvious to others. If a choice feels natural, it must be the common choice. The pattern gets reinforced by who you spend time with. Friends tend to share similar views. Colleagues often think alike. Social circles cluster around agreement. So when you check your assumptions against the people around you, they confirm what you already believe. The consensus feels real because everyone you talk to seems to agree. But that's not consensus. That's selection bias dressed up as validation. The effect shows up in small ways. You assume everyone prefers the same coffee, listens to the same music, finds the same jokes funny. And it shows up in larger ones. You assume most people share your politics, your ethics, your sense of what's fair. When you encounter someone who doesn't, it doesn't feel like a difference of opinion. It feels like they're the outlier, the exception, the one who got it wrong. The cost builds quietly. You stop explaining your perspective because you assume it's already understood. You dismiss opposing views as fringe when they're often mainstream. You misread the room, confident that most people are on your side when the split is closer than you think. And in relationships, the effect creates invisible friction. You expect your partner to react the way you would. When they don't, it feels like a failure to understand something basic. You assume your friends share your boundaries, your comfort levels, your unspoken rules. When they cross a line you never drew out loud, it feels like betrayal when it was just miscommunication. The false consensus effect doesn't just make you wrong about what others think. It makes you certain you're right. And that certainty, built on nothing more than projection, shapes how you interpret everything that follows. Halo effect. One good impression erases a dozen flaws. One bad impression taints everything that follows. You meet someone who's well-dressed and articulate. Instantly, they seem competent, trustworthy, intelligent. You haven't seen their work. You don't know their history. But the impression is already set. They look the part, so your mind fills in the rest. Or the opposite happens. Someone shows up disheveled and stumbles through an introduction. Now every word they say gets filtered through that first impression. Even if they're brilliant, the halo never forms. The image is already fixed. This is the halo effect. One visible trait, positive or negative, bleeds into your judgment of everything else about that person. Attractive people get rated as more capable. Confident speakers get assumed to be more knowledgeable. A single strength creates a glow that makes other qualities seem stronger than they are. The effect isn't conscious. You don't decide to assume someone attractive is also kind. Your brain makes the leap automatically, stitching together a coherent image from incomplete information. If someone seems good in one area, they must be good in others. If they seem flawed in one way, other flaws must be hiding just beneath the surface. The pattern plays out everywhere. In hiring, candidates who interview well get rated higher on skills that were never tested. In classrooms, teachers expect more from students who look engaged, then interpret their work more generously. In relationships, early charm makes red flags easier to ignore. The halo glows bright enough to hide what's underneath. And it works in reverse. One mistake, one awkward moment, one visible flaw, and the whole impression darkens. A strong resume gets dismissed because of a weak handshake. A valid argument gets ignored because the speaker seemed nervous. The horn effect, the shadow version of the halo, is just as powerful. What makes it dangerous is how sticky the effect is. First impressions don't fade easily. Once the halo forms, contradicting evidence gets downplayed or reinterpreted to fit the original image. You hired someone because they seemed sharp in the interview. When their work underperforms, you assume they're having an off week, not that you misjudged them. The halo protects itself, and you do this to yourself too. You meet someone who shares one of your values and assume they share all of them. You like one thing about a product and suddenly everything about it seems better. You admire one trait in a leader and start defending their weaknesses as strengths. The halo doesn't reveal truth. It just makes one piece of information feel like the whole picture. And once that picture locks in, everything else bends to fit. Illusion of transparency. How obvious are your emotions right now? If you're anxious, do people see it? If you're annoyed, can they tell? If you're trying to hide disappointment, how well is it working? You probably think it's more obvious than it is. You're sitting in a meeting, heart racing, convinced everyone can see your nerves. You're frustrated with a friend and certain your tone gave it away. You're trying to stay neutral during a tense conversation, sure that your real feelings are written all over your face. But they're not. Most of the time, what feels glaring to you is invisible to everyone else. This is the illusion of transparency. It's the belief that your internal state, your thoughts and emotions, are more visible to others than they actually are. You feel something intensely, so your mind assumes others can see it just as clearly. But emotions don't broadcast the way you think they do. The illusion happens because you have full access to what you're feeling. Every flicker of anxiety, every surge of irritation, every moment of discomfort registers in sharp detail. You're living inside that emotional state, experiencing it at full volume. So it feels impossible that others wouldn't notice. But they don't have that access. They only see the outside, the surface-level cues, and those cues are far weaker than the emotions driving them. Your internal experience is loud. What others perceive is a faint echo. Research confirms this gap. People who feel nervous during presentations consistently overestimate how much their anxiety showed. Participants asked to lie believed their dishonesty was obvious when observers detected almost nothing. The disconnect between how you feel and how you appear is wider than you think. The effect creates strange problems. You hold back from speaking up because you're convinced your uncertainty is visible. You avoid difficult conversations because you think your discomfort will give you away. You assume people can read your frustration, so you never say it out loud, then resent them for not responding to something they never saw. And it works in reverse too. You think your appreciation is obvious, so you don't say thank you. You assume your affection is clear, so you don't express it. You believe your intentions are transparent, so you're shocked when they get misread. The illusion makes you assume communication is happening when it isn't. In relationships, the effect compounds. You're hurt and expect your partner to notice. When they don't, it feels like they don't care, when the reality is simpler, they genuinely didn't see it. You try to hide disappointment and think you succeeded, then wonder why the other person seems oblivious to the tension you're convinced is filling the room. The illusion of transparency doesn't just create miscommunication. It creates resentment. You expect people to respond to emotions they can't see. And when they don't, you interpret their failure to read your mind as a failure to care. The gap between what you feel and what others perceive becomes a gap in the relationship itself. What you're feeling is real. But it's not as visible as it seems. And expecting others to see what you haven't shown them is a setup for disappointment. Fundamental attribution error. Someone cuts in line. They're rude, selfish, inconsiderate. You cut in line. You were in a rush, distracted, didn't realize. Someone snaps at you. They're hostile, unstable, difficult. You snap at someone. You were stressed, overwhelmed, having a bad day. The pattern repeats constantly. When others behave badly, you blame their character. When you behave badly, you blame the situation. The same action gets explained two completely different ways depending on who's doing it. This is the fundamental attribution error. It's the tendency to attribute other people's behavior to their personality while attributing your own behavior to circumstances. When someone else fails, they're incompetent. When you fail, the task was impossible. When someone else succeeds, they got lucky. When you succeed, you earned it. The error happens because of perspective. When you observe someone else, you see their actions but not their context. You don't know what happened before they walked into the room. You don't see the pressure they're under, the information they're missing, the constraints they're navigating. So your mind fills the gap by assuming their behavior reflects who they are. But when you act, you have full access to your own context. You know you're late because traffic was brutal, not because you're careless. You know you were short with someone because you'd been dealing with problems all morning, not because you're a difficult person. Your situation is visible to you, so it becomes the explanation. The effect creates a strange double standard. You judge yourself by your intentions and others by their actions. You give yourself the benefit of context and deny it to everyone else. And because this happens automatically, it feels fair. It feels like you're just seeing people clearly. The pattern shows up everywhere. At work, when a colleague misses a deadline, you assume they're lazy. When you miss one, it's because you were overloaded. In traffic, when someone drives aggressively, they're a jerk. When you do, you were running late for something important. In relationships, when your partner forgets something, they don't care. When you forget, you were distracted by other responsibilities. The error doesn't just make you wrong about other people. It makes conflicts worse. You interpret their actions as personality flaws that need fixing, while they see those same actions as reasonable responses to situations you don't understand. So you're solving for the wrong problem. You're trying to change who they are when the real issue is what they're dealing with. And the reverse is just as damaging. When people judge you, they're making the same error. They see your worst moments and assume that's who you are. They don't see the context, the pressure, the circumstances that led you there. And when you try to explain, it sounds like excuses. Because to them, your character is the explanation. The fundamental attribution error makes everyone else look worse than they are and makes you look better than you deserve. It turns normal human responses to difficult situations into evidence of moral failure. And it does it so smoothly that you never notice you're doing it. You just think you're seeing people for who they really are. Pluralistic ignorance. The lecture hall is silent. No one raises a hand. No one asks a question. The professor asks if everyone understands. Heads nod. The room moves forward. But half the class is lost. They just don't know everyone else is too. You assume you're the only one confused. Everyone else seems confident, engaged, following along. So you stay quiet. You don't want to be the one who didn't get it. And while you're sitting there convinced you're alone in your confusion, the person next to you is doing the exact same thing. This is pluralistic ignorance. It's the gap between what people privately think and what they believe everyone else thinks. You assume the group consensus is different from your own view, so you conform to a standard that doesn't actually exist. The pattern works because humans are terrible at reading what others actually think. You see their behavior, their expressions, their silence. But you don't see their doubts. So you fill in the blank with an assumption they must understand, they must agree, they must be fine with this. And because everyone is making the same assumption, the illusion holds. It shows up everywhere. College students overestimate how much their peers drink, so they drink more to fit a norm that's exaggerated. Employees stay silent in meetings, assuming everyone else supports a decision they privately oppose. No one speaks up because everyone thinks they're the outlier. The effect gets worse in groups. The larger the crowd, the harder it is to see what individuals actually think. So you rely on surface cues. And surface cues lie. Someone staying silent might be deeply opposed or just unsure. Someone nodding might agree completely or just be avoiding conflict. You can't tell the difference, so you assume agreement. And once the illusion sets, it becomes self-reinforcing. You conform to what you think the group wants. Others see your conformity and assume you agree. Now they're conforming to match you. The cycle continues, with everyone adjusting their behavior to fit a consensus no one actually holds. The damage isn't just in the moment. Pluralistic ignorance shapes long-term norms. Practices continue because everyone assumes everyone else supports them. Policies stay in place because no one realizes how many people quietly disagree. The group moves forward in a direction no individual wanted, all because no one checked if the consensus was real. What makes it cruel is how isolating it feels. You think you're alone. You think everyone else has it figured out. And that belief keeps you silent, which keeps everyone else silent, which makes the illusion unbreakable. The consensus you're afraid to challenge doesn't exist. But as long as everyone believes it does, it might as well be real. Horn effect. One flaw erases everything else. One mistake becomes the lens through which every other action gets judged. You meet someone who's late to the first meeting. Now everything about them registers differently. When they speak up, it sounds defensive. When they contribute, it feels like overcompensation. When they succeed, it seems like luck. The initial impression didn't just stick. It poisoned everything that followed. This is the horn effect, the dark twin of the halo. Where the halo makes strengths glow brighter, the horn makes weaknesses spread wider. One negative trait doesn't stay isolated. It bleeds into your perception of everything else, turning neutral actions into confirmation of what you already decided. The effect works the same way the halo does, just in reverse. Your brain stitches together a coherent story from limited information. If someone seems unreliable in one moment, they must be unreliable in general. If they come across as careless once, carelessness must define them. The horn creates a shadow that darkens the whole picture, and it's ruthless. A poor first impression makes every strength look weaker. A candidate stumbles in an interview, and suddenly their impressive resume gets reread as exaggerated. A new colleague misses a deadline, and their good ideas get dismissed as surface level. A friend says something awkward, and now every comment they make sounds off. The effect doesn't need much to take hold. One visible mistake. One moment of poor judgment. One bad day that happened to land in front of the wrong audience. That's enough. The horn forms, and from that point forward, everything gets filtered through it. What makes it worse is how sticky it becomes. Once the negative impression sets, contradicting evidence doesn't correct it. It gets reinterpreted. Someone with a horn performs well, and you assume they got help or the task was easy. They're kind, and it reads as manipulation. They apologize, and it feels insincere. The horn protects itself by warping anything that challenges it. The effect shows up quietly in workplaces. Someone hired despite a weak interview never shakes the doubt. Managers keep watching for signs they were right to be skeptical, and every minor slip becomes proof. In relationships, one argument creates a narrative. Now every disagreement fits into a story about who that person really is. The horn doesn't just judge a moment. It rewrites history and predicts the future. And you do it to yourself. You meet someone who shares one trait you dislike, and suddenly everything about them feels wrong. You distrust one aspect of a decision, and now the whole plan seems flawed. The horn doesn't reveal truth. It just makes one piece of negative information expand until it blocks out everything else. The shadow doesn't fade easily. And once it's cast, it takes far more effort to remove than it ever took to form. Naive realism. Why don't people see things the way you do? Why do they miss what's obvious? Why do they interpret the same situation so differently? The answer you probably reach: they're biased, misinformed, blinded by ideology, emotion, self-interest. They're not seeing reality clearly. You are. That assumption, the certainty that your perception is objective while everyone else's is distorted, is naive realism. It's the belief that you see the world as it actually is, and anyone who disagrees must be seeing it wrong. Clonk. The pattern works because you have direct access to your own thoughts. You experience your perspective as clear, logical, grounded in facts. You don't feel like you're interpreting. It feels like you're just observing. So when someone reaches a different conclusion from the same information, it doesn't register as a difference in interpretation. It registers as a failure on their part. And here's the trap: everyone feels this way. The person who disagrees with you is just as certain their view is objective. They think you're the one who's biased, the one missing the obvious truth. Both sides are convinced they're seeing clearly and the other is distorted. And because both sides believe their perception is reality, the disagreement becomes unsolvable. Naive realism doesn't just create conflict. It makes resolution nearly impossible. If you believe you're seeing things objectively, then compromise feels like accepting a lie. If their view is wrong, why would you meet them halfway? The only reasonable option is for them to see what you see. But they're thinking the exact same thing. The effect shows up everywhere. Political debates where both sides are baffled the other can't see the truth. Workplace conflicts where colleagues are certain the other person is being unreasonable. Relationships where partners each believe they're the one being rational while the other is overreacting. What makes it dangerous is how invisible it is. You don't feel like you're falling into naive realism. You feel like you're just being honest. The bias disguises itself as clarity. And because it feels like clarity, you never question it. The pattern compounds in groups. When everyone around you shares the same perspective, it stops feeling like a perspective. It feels like reality. Disagreement doesn't just seem wrong. It seems incomprehensible. How could anyone see it differently unless they're ignorant, corrupt, or irrational? And once you've decided someone else is biased, everything they say gets filtered through that lens. Their arguments aren't considered on merit. They're dismissed as products of their bias. Which means you never actually engage with the perspective. You just reject it, convinced that you're protecting objectivity when you're really protecting your own view from challenge. Naive realism doesn't just make you wrong about others. It makes you certain you're right. And that certainty is what keeps the gap unbridgeable. Actor-observer bias. You're rushing through the grocery store, distracted, and nearly knock into someone. You were in a hurry. You didn't see them. It was an accident. Someone rushes past you in the same store and nearly knocks you over. They're careless, inconsiderate. Not paying attention. Same action. Different explanation. When you do it, the situation caused it. When they do it, their character caused it. This double standard, judging your own behavior by context and others' behavior by personality, plays out constantly. It's not something you decide to do. It's automatic. And it makes you far more forgiving of yourself than you are of anyone else. The split happens because of what you can see. When you act, you're aware of everything leading up to that moment. The pressures, the distractions, the constraints. You know you're not normally like this. You know the situation pushed you. So the situation becomes the explanation. But when you watch someone else, you don't see their context. You just see the action. And without context, the action feels like a choice. A reflection of who they are. So their character becomes the explanation. The pattern creates a strange asymmetry. You're late because traffic was terrible. They're late because they're irresponsible. You're short with someone because you've had a rough day. They're short because they're rude. You make a mistake because the instructions were unclear. They make a mistake because they're careless. It doesn't stop at small moments. The bias warps how you understand long-term patterns. You see your struggles as responses to difficult circumstances. You see others' struggles as personal failings. You're underemployed because the economy is tough. They're underemployed because they lack drive. You're stressed because your workload is unreasonable. They're stressed because they can't handle pressure. The effect makes conflicts worse. When your partner forgets something important, you see it as a sign they don't care. When you forget, it's because you were overwhelmed. When a colleague misses a deadline, they're unreliable. When you miss one, the deadline was unrealistic. You're solving for completely different problems because you're explaining the same behavior in completely different ways. And the reverse cuts just as deep. Other people are doing this to you. They're watching you mess up and assuming it's who you are, not what you're dealing with. Your explanations sound like excuses because they've already decided your character is the issue. The context you're trying to share doesn't land because they're not looking for context. They're looking for confirmation of what they already concluded. The bias doesn't just make you unfair to others. It makes you blind to how unfair others are being to you. You think you're seeing people clearly. They think they're seeing you clearly, and neither of you realizes you're both running the same flawed calculation, just pointed in opposite directions. Projection bias. Your preferences feel universal. The music you love feels objectively good. The food you hate seems obviously bad. The temperature that's comfortable to you should be comfortable to everyone. When someone disagrees, it doesn't feel like a difference in taste. It feels like they're wrong. This happens because your mind uses itself as the template for normal. If you're cold, the room is cold. If you're anxious, the situation is stressful. If you're uninterested, the topic is boring. What you feel becomes what is, and you expect others to feel the same. This is projection bias. It's the assumption that other people's internal states, preferences, and reactions mirror your own. You project your experience onto them, then get confused when they respond differently. The bias works quietly. You don't actively think, everyone must feel exactly like me. You just operate as if they do. You plan a group outing based on what you'd enjoy, assuming it's what everyone wants. You give advice based on what would work for you, assuming it'll work for them. You interpret someone's mood based on how you'd feel in their position, missing that they might feel completely different. The effect shows up constantly in small ways. You're full, so you assume everyone else at the table is too. You're bored by a movie, so you're surprised when your friend loved it. You find a joke funny, so you're caught off guard when it falls flat. The mismatch doesn't register as a difference in preference. It registers as them being unusual. And it compounds in relationships. You assume your partner needs space when you need space, missing that they actually need closeness. You think they're upset because you'd be upset in that situation, when they're actually fine. You offer comfort the way you'd want to be comforted, not the way they need. The projection creates a gap. You're responding to your own feelings, not theirs. The bias doesn't just misread the present. It warps predictions. You imagine how you'd feel in a future scenario, then assume that's how you actually will feel. You think you'll want the same things next year that you want now. You believe your current preferences are stable when they're not. So you make decisions based on a version of yourself that won't exist when the moment arrives. Retailers exploit this. You're hungry when you shop, so you buy more food than you'll want later. You're cold when you pack, so you overpack warm clothes for a trip where you'll be too hot. The projection makes your future self a stranger, someone whose needs you consistently misread. And it makes you bad at empathy. You think you understand what someone else is going through because you imagine what you'd feel. But you're not imagining their experience. You're imagining your own reaction transplanted into their situation, which means you're not actually connecting with them. You're just talking to a projection of yourself. The assumption that others are like you isn't empathy. It's a shortcut, and it fails more often than it works. Self-fulfilling prophecy. You expect someone to dislike you, so you're tense around them, guarded, a little cold. They pick up on it. Now they're uncomfortable too, distant, less warm than they'd normally be. You notice the distance. It confirms what you suspected. They don't like you, except they might have, until your expectation changed how you acted. This is a self-fulfilling prophecy, a belief that alters behavior in ways that make the belief come true. You don't just predict the future. You create it, then mistake the result for proof you were right all along. The mechanism is simple. Expectations shape actions. If you believe something will happen, you act as if it's already true. And those actions create the conditions that make it real. The prophecy fulfills itself, not because you saw the future, but because you built it. The pattern plays out everywhere. A teacher expects a student to struggle, so they give less attention, fewer opportunities, lower quality feedback. The student, receiving less support, performs worse. The teacher sees the poor performance as confirmation the student lacks ability. But the ability was never the issue. The expectation was. Or a manager believes an employee is unreliable, so they micromanage, double-check everything, assign fewer responsibilities. The employee, feeling distrusted, disengages. Their performance drops. The manager's belief gets confirmed, missing that the decline started the moment the expectation formed. It happens in relationships too. You assume a partner is pulling away, so you pull back first. They notice the distance and start withdrawing to protect themselves. Now you're both distant, each convinced the other started it. The prophecy created the problem it predicted. What makes it insidious is how invisible it is. You don't see your expectations shaping the outcome. You just see the outcome. And because the outcome matches what you expected, it feels like validation. You were right. You saw it coming. Except you didn't see it coming. You caused it. The effect doesn't need malice. You don't have to want the outcome. You just have to believe it's likely. That belief is enough. It seeps into tone, body language, micro-decisions. You're not consciously sabotaging. You're just acting in ways that align with what you think is true. And the world responds accordingly. And it works in reverse. Positive expectations create positive outcomes. You believe someone is capable, so you give them challenges, trust, room to grow. They rise to meet it. You believe a project will succeed, so you invest energy, take risks, push through obstacles. The success confirms your optimism, missing that the optimism was what made success possible. The prophecy doesn't reveal the future. It scripts it. And because you're living inside the script, you never see the difference between prediction and creation. The line between what you expected and what you caused disappears completely. You think you're observing reality. You're authoring it. Correspondence bias. A colleague snaps at you during a meeting. The room goes quiet. You chalk it up immediately. They're aggressive, difficult, someone who can't control their temper. The idea that they might be dealing with something outside that room, something pressing or painful, barely crosses your mind. Later, you snap at someone. But you know exactly why. You've been dealing with impossible deadlines, personal stress, a situation that finally broke through. It wasn't about them. It wasn't even about you. It was the circumstances. Same behavior, completely different explanations. When others act a certain way, you assume it reflects their character. When you act the same way, you know the situation forced it. This tendency to overestimate personality and underestimate circumstance when judging others is correspondence bias. It's the reflex to assume behavior corresponds directly to who someone is, ignoring the context that shaped it. The bias works because context is invisible from the outside. You see what someone does. You don't see what led them there. The pressures, the constraints, the information they're working with. So your mind fills the gap with the simplest explanation. That's just who they are. But when you act, context is all you see. You're drowning in it. Every decision you make feels justified by the situation surrounding it. You're not rude. You're overwhelmed. You're not lazy. You're exhausted. You're not careless. The instructions were unclear. The context doesn't just explain your behavior. It excuses it. The asymmetry creates a brutal double standard. Someone makes a mistake, and you question their competence. You make the same mistake, and you question the system. Someone gets defensive, and they're insecure. You get defensive, and you're protecting yourself from an unfair attack. Someone struggles, and it's a personal failing. You struggle, and it's because the challenge was unreasonable. The pattern doesn't just make you unfair. It makes conflicts unsolvable. You're trying to fix their personality when the real issue is the situation they're navigating. They're trying to explain the context. But to you, it sounds like excuses. You've already decided their character is the problem. The context you'd use to explain your own behavior doesn't apply to them. And everyone is running this same bias in reverse. When you mess up, they're not seeing your context. They're seeing your character. Your explanations don't land because they've already formed their conclusion. The situation you're describing feels irrelevant to them. They're solving for who you are, not what you're dealing with. Correspondence bias doesn't just make you wrong about others. It makes you certain you're seeing them clearly. And that certainty is what keeps the misunderstanding locked in place. Stereotyping. You're introduced to someone at a party. Engineer. Within seconds, your mind fills in details you were never told. Reserved, logical, probably good with numbers. Maybe awkward in social settings. You don't know this person, but the category gave you a script and you're already reading from it. Or you meet someone older. Instantly, assumptions form. Out of touch with technology. Set in their ways. Resistant to change. You haven't had a conversation yet, but the age became a story and the story became the person. This automatic sorting, the moment a category becomes a set of assumptions, is stereotyping. It's the mind's shortcut for handling complexity. Instead of treating each person as an individual, you use group membership as a template. The template tells you what to expect, and you start seeing what you expected. The mechanism is efficient. Your brain processes thousands of interactions. It can't assess everyone from scratch, so it uses patterns, categories. If most engineers you've met were analytical, the category engineer gets tagged with conalytical. Next time you meet an engineer, the tag activates before you've learned anything about them. The problem is that categories aren't people. The engineer in front of you might be wildly creative, extroverted, terrible at math. But the stereotype loaded first, and now everything they do gets filtered through it. When they do fit the stereotype, it confirms your assumption. When they don't, you treat them as the exception. The stereotype never updates because it's designed to protect itself. And stereotypes don't just predict behavior, they shape it. You assume someone is unfriendly based on their group, so you're colder, more distant. They pick up on it and respond in kind. Now they seem unfriendly, and your assumption feels validated. The stereotype didn't reveal the truth. It created the outcome it expected. The effect compounds in workplaces. You assume someone from a certain background won't fit the team culture, so you don't invest in the relationship. They feel excluded and disengage. The disengagement confirms your initial doubt. You hired someone you expected to struggle, then built the conditions that made struggle inevitable. It shows up in everyday interactions too. You see someone's accent and assume limited understanding, so you speak slower, simpler. They notice the condescension and pull back. You interpret the withdrawal as proof they didn't want to engage. The loop closes. The stereotype survives. What makes stereotyping insidious is how automatic it is. You don't decide to stereotype. The associations fire before conscious thought. By the time you're aware of your impression, it's already formed. And because it feels like observation, you don't question it. You think you're noticing patterns. You're imposing them. Stereotypes don't save time. They cost it. Every assumption you make based on a category is an assumption you didn't verify. And most of the time, the person standing in front of you is nothing like the template you loaded. But you'll never know, because you stopped looking the moment the category clicked into place. Outgroup homogeneity bias. Your team is diverse. Each person has distinct quirks, strengths, areas they struggle with. You see the differences clearly because you work with them daily. But the team across the hall, they all seem the same, interchangeable. You couldn't tell most of them apart if you tried. It's not that the other team is actually less diverse. It's that you're not looking closely enough to see it. And you're not looking closely because they're not your group. This tendency to see your own group as varied and other groups as uniform is outgroup homogeneity bias. The closer a group is to you, the more individual its members become. The further away, the more they blur together into a single entity. The pattern works because of exposure. You spend time with your group. You see them in different contexts, moods, situations. That exposure reveals complexity. You know, one person is sharp in meetings but struggles with deadlines. Another is quiet in groups but brilliant one-on-one. The differences are obvious because you've seen enough to notice them. But with the outgroup, you don't have that depth. You see them in passing, in narrow contexts, through limited interactions. So your mind fills the gap with generalization. They're all competitive. They're all cliquish. They're all the same. The lack of information doesn't stop you from forming conclusions. It just makes the conclusion simpler. The bias shows up everywhere. Fans of rival teams see their own supporters as passionate individuals with unique reasons for their loyalty. The other side, just a mindless mob. Employees in different departments view their own team as specialists with varied skills. The other department. Bureaucrats who all think alike. It even shapes how groups see each other across divides. Political opposites view their own side as a coalition of thoughtful people with nuanced positions. The other side. Extremists who march in lockstep. Each group sees diversity within and uniformity without. And, because both sides are running the same bias, the divide deepens. What makes it dangerous is how it fuels dehumanization. When you see a group as homogeneous, you stop seeing individuals. The outgroup becomes a block, a type, a threat. Exceptions don't register because you're not looking for them. And when conflict arises, you're not fighting people. You're fighting a category. That makes cruelty easier. The bias doesn't just distort perception. It creates self-fulfilling dynamics. You treat the outgroup as uniform, so you don't bother learning who they actually are. They notice the lack of interest and stop trying to connect. Now the distance you assumed was natural becomes real. The homogeneity you imagined gets reinforced by the separation you created. And the reverse is just as powerful. The outgroup is doing the same thing to you. They see your group as monolithic while you see it as diverse. You're both wrong in the same way, each convinced the other side is simpler than it actually is. The bias doesn't reveal difference, it manufactures it. Ingroup bias. You're part of a team. When your team wins, it's because of talent, effort, strategy. When the other team wins, it's luck, circumstances, maybe even questionable tactics. When your team loses, it's bad luck or external factors. When the other team loses, it's because they deserved it. Same outcomes. Different explanations. The group you belong to gets the benefit of interpretation. The group you don't becomes the target of it. This automatic favoritism toward your own group, the instinct to see your side as better, fairer, more deserving, is ingroup bias. It's not a conscious decision. It's a reflex. The moment you identify with a group, your perception tilts in its favor. The bias doesn't need much to activate. The group doesn't have to be meaningful. Researchers have triggered it with arbitrary labels, random assignments, trivial distinctions. Put people in a red team versus a blue team, and within minutes, they'll start favoring their own color. The group itself doesn't matter. The fact of belonging does. Once the bias kicks in, it warps everything. Your group's successes get attributed to internal qualities. Skill, intelligence, character. Failures get blamed on external forces. Bad timing, unfair rules, obstacles beyond control. The outgroup gets the reverse treatment. Their successes are external. Luck, easy conditions, advantages they didn't earn. Their failures are internal. Weakness, incompetence, moral failings. The pattern plays out constantly. Coworkers in your department are hardworking and competent. Coworkers in other departments are lazy or overpaid. Your political party is principled and reasonable. The other party is corrupt or deluded. Your friend group is authentic and supportive. Other social circles are shallow or cliquish. And it's not just about perception. The bias drives behavior. You give your group more chances, more forgiveness, more resources. You're quicker to trust, slower to criticize, more willing to overlook mistakes. The outgroup gets scrutinized, doubted, held to higher standards. Same actions, different thresholds. The effect compounds in hiring, promotions, opportunities. You see potential in people who remind you of your group. You see risk in people who don't. The in-group gets mentorship, second chances, benefit of the doubt. The out-group has to prove themselves repeatedly. The playing field isn't level because the bias tilts it before anyone even starts. What makes in-group bias powerful is how justified it feels. You're not being unfair. You're recognizing quality. You're not playing favorites. You're making sound judgments based on what you know. The bias hides behind rationality, dressing up favoritism as discernment. And everyone is doing it. Every group favors itself. Every side believes it's the reasonable one. The bias doesn't just create division. It makes division feel correct. You're not biased. You're just seeing your group clearly. The problem is everyone else doing the same thing. Each one certain their favoritism is the exception. Illusory correlation. Every time you wear a certain shirt, things go wrong. Meetings fall apart, emails get lost, small disasters pile up. The pattern feels undeniable. That shirt is unlucky. You stop wearing it. Except there's no pattern. You've worn that shirt dozens of times without incident. But the handful of times something went wrong, you noticed. The correlation you're seeing isn't there. Your mind built it from coincidence. This tendency to perceive relationships between events that aren't actually connected is illusory correlation. It's the brain's pattern detection system misfiring, finding links where none exist. And once the illusion forms, it's nearly impossible to shake. The effect happens because of how memory works. You don't record every instance equally. Unusual pairings stick. When two uncommon things happen together, the combination feels significant. You remember it. But when they don't happen together, which is most of the time, it fades into background noise. Say you meet someone from a particular profession, and they happen to be rude. The pairing stands out. Rude plus that profession. You remember it. Later, you meet a dozen polite people from the same profession. Those interactions don't register as strongly because they're less distinctive. So when you think about that profession, the rude person comes to mind first. The correlation feels real even though it's based on a single memorable exception. The bias doesn't just distort memory. It shapes perception going forward. Once you believe the correlation exists, you start looking for evidence that confirms it. When you see the pairing again, it reinforces the belief. When you don't, it gets dismissed as the outlier. The illusion protects itself by filtering what you notice. It shows up in harmful ways. People perceive correlations between minority groups and negative traits, not because the data supports it, but because the pairing is distinctive and memorable. The correlation becomes a stereotype. The stereotype becomes a justification for discrimination. The actual statistics, which don't support the link, never get checked because the illusion already feels true. And it happens in everyday decisions. You think you perform better when you follow a certain routine, so you stick to it religiously. But you've never tested whether the routine actually makes a difference. You just remember the times it seemed to work, and forget the times it didn't. The correlation is a story your memory tells, not a pattern in reality. What makes illusory correlation dangerous is how resistant it is to correction. You can be shown evidence that the correlation doesn't exist, and it still feels real. The memorable instances outweigh the data. Your brain trusts the vividness of the few over the statistics of the many. The correlation you're certain you see might be noise. The pattern you're following might be random. But as long as the illusion holds, you'll keep acting as if it's true. And the more you act on it, the more real it feels, even when reality never supported it in the first place. False uniqueness effect. You pride yourself on thinking independently, not following trends. Seeing things others miss. Your perspective feels distinct, sharper, less swayed by groupthink. You're not like most people. You've always known that. Except you're more common than you think. The traits you believe make you unique, the qualities you think set you apart, are shared by far more people than you realize. You're not the outlier. You're closer to the median. But admitting that feels impossible because the belief in your uniqueness is part of how you see yourself. This tendency to overestimate how rare your abilities, opinions, and positive traits are is the false uniqueness effect. It's the flip side of false consensus. Where false consensus makes you think everyone agrees with you, false uniqueness makes you think no one else is quite like you. The effect works because of how you experience yourself versus others. You have full access to your internal world. Your thoughts, your struggles, your moments of insight. That depth makes you feel complex, layered, individual. But you don't see that depth in others. You see their surface. So they seem simpler, more predictable, more like each other. And by comparison, you feel distinct. The bias shows up in small ways. You think your taste in music is more eclectic than it is. You believe your sense of humor is more sophisticated. You assume your work ethic is stronger, your judgment sharper, your integrity higher. You're not actively comparing yourself to others. You just quietly hold the belief that you're operating at a level most people aren't. And it distorts how you interpret success and failure. When you succeed, it feels earned. You did something others couldn't. When you fail, it's unusual, an anomaly, not representative of who you are. But when others succeed, you downplay it. Lots of people could have done that. And when they fail, it fits. That's just the norm. Your outcomes feel more meaningful because you've already decided you're more exceptional. The effect doesn't just inflate ego. It warps relationships. You underestimate how much you have in common with others because you're focused on what makes you different. You assume your partner won't understand your perspective because it feels too specific to you. You think your colleagues don't share your values because your version of those values feels more genuine. The uniqueness you imagine creates distance that doesn't need to exist. And it makes you bad at prediction. You assume your preferences are rare, so you don't expect others to share them. Then you're surprised when they do. You think your skills are uncommon, so you underestimate the competition. Then you're blindsided when you're not the standout you expected to be. What makes the effect cruel is that it's invisible from the inside. You can't see your own ordinariness because ordinariness doesn't feel ordinary when you're living it. Your life, your thoughts, your choices, they all feel significant because they're yours. The idea that millions of people are navigating similar experiences, thinking similar thoughts, making similar choices, doesn't register. You're convinced you're writing an original story when you're mostly following the script everyone else is reading. The uniqueness you're certain defines you might just be the norm. But as long as you can't see yourself from the outside, you'll keep believing you're the exception. And that belief, shared by nearly everyone, is the most common thing about you. Social projection. You can't stand loud restaurants. The noise makes conversation impossible, food tasteless, the whole experience draining. So when you're planning dinner with friends, you pick somewhere quiet. It doesn't cross your mind that they might actually prefer the energy, the buzz, the feeling of being somewhere alive. You're not trying to impose your preference. You genuinely assume it's everyone's preference. That assumption, treating your own experience as the default, happens constantly. And most of the time, you don't even notice you're doing it. Social projection is the automatic belief that others think, feel, and want what you do. Your internal state becomes the template. If you're tired, you assume everyone else is ready to leave. If you're engaged, you expect others are too. If something bothers you, it must bother them. The projection isn't deliberate. It's your mind using the only perspective it has direct access to, yours. The pattern works because you can't feel what others feel. You only know your own reactions. So when you try to predict what someone else wants, your brain reeks for the closest reference point. You. If you'd enjoy something, they probably will too. If you'd hate it, they probably would as well. The logic feels sound because it's based on real data. It's just that the data only comes from one person. And it shows up everywhere. You're hungry, so you suggest getting food, not realizing the other person just ate. You're cold, so you turn up the heat, missing that they're already warm. You find a topic fascinating, so you keep talking, blind to the fact they checked out minutes ago. The projection makes you confident you're reading the room when you're really just reading yourself. It compounds in relationships. You assume your partner needs the same kind of reassurance you do. When they don't respond to it, you're confused. They weren't asking for what you're giving, but you gave it anyway because it's what you would have wanted. You project your needs onto them, then feel hurt when they don't seem grateful for something they never needed. The effect also warps how you interpret reactions. Someone seems upset, and you assume it's for the reason that would upset you. But their upset might have nothing to do with your assumption. You're solving for your psychology, not theirs. The mismatch creates confusion. You're offering solutions to problems they don't have while missing the actual issue entirely. What makes social projection tricky is that sometimes it works. People do share preferences, needs, reactions. But when it fails silently. You never realize the projection was wrong because the other person didn't correct you, or you didn't notice their discomfort, or you mistook politeness for agreement. The errors accumulate invisibly. The projection doesn't reveal what others want. It just tells you what you'd want in their position. And most of the time, that's not the same thing. Transparency illusion in communication. You send a carefully worded email. The tone is measured, the phrasing deliberate. You've layered in context, softened the edges, made your position clear without being harsh. You hit send, confident the message will land exactly as intended. It doesn't. The recipient reads it as cold or aggressive or confusing. The nuance you built in. Invisible. The care you took with tone. Didn't translate. What felt obvious to you was lost in transmission. This gap, the belief that your intended meaning comes through more clearly than it actually does, is the transparency illusion in communication. You think you're being understood because you know what you meant. But the other person doesn't have that context. They only have the words. And words without context are wide open to interpretation. The illusion works because you write or speak from inside your own head. You hear the tone you intended. You feel the emotion behind it. You see the full picture you're trying to convey. So when you put it into words, those words feel sufficient. They carry all the meaning you meant them to carry. But that's only true for you. The recipient doesn't have your internal soundtrack. They're working with less information, filling gaps with assumptions that might be completely wrong. And it happens in reverse too. You assume your confusion, your hesitation, your uncertainty is visible to others. You think they can tell you're struggling, but they can't. What feels glaringly obvious inside your head is often completely hidden from view. So you don't ask for help because you assume they already know you need it. They don't offer because they don't see the need. The gap widens because both sides think the signal is getting through when it isn't. The illusion creates strange problems. You soften criticism, sure the other person will hear it as gentle correction. They hear it as vague or dismissive. You express enthusiasm in what feels like clear terms. They miss it entirely, reading your message as neutral. You try to signal interest without being pushy. They interpret it as disinterest. The meaning you're certain you've communicated lands as something completely different. It gets worse in text. Emails, messages, any written communication strips out tone, body language, timing. You think exclamation points convey warmth. They might read as sarcasm. You think brevity signals efficiency. It lands as coldness. You think a delayed response shows thoughtfulness. It registers as avoidance. The illusion makes you confident the message is clear when the medium itself is stripping meaning out. And because you can't see the gap, you don't correct it. You assume clarity where none exists. Misunderstandings pile up. Relationships strain. All because you believed your intent was transparent when it was anything but. The message you sent and the message they received aren't the same. But you won't know that unless someone says it out loud. And most of the time, they don't. Egocentric bias. Think back to the last group project you worked on. How much of the work did you do? If you're like most people, your estimate is higher than reality. Not because you're lying, because that's genuinely how it feels. You remember your contributions in vivid detail. The late nights, the problem-solving, the moments you saved the project. Other people's contributions. Hazier, less detailed, easier to underestimate. This tendency to overweight your own role, effort, and impact is egocentric bias. Your perspective is locked to your own experience. You see what you did. You feel what you contributed. Everyone else's work registers as background. The imbalance isn't intentional. It's structural. You're always the protagonist in your own story. The bias shows up everywhere. In relationships, both partners overestimate how much they contribute to household tasks, emotional labor, conflict resolution. Ask each person what percentage they handle, and the numbers don't add up. Each person is tracking their own effort with perfect clarity, and everyone else's with rough approximation. The math breaks because everyone's anchored to themselves. At work, it happens constantly. You remember the meetings you led, the ideas you contributed, the problems you solved. Your colleagues remember the same pattern, just starring themselves. When credit gets distributed, everyone feels shortchanged because everyone genuinely believes they did more than they're getting recognized for. The disconnect isn't about dishonesty. It's about asymmetric information. You lived your contributions. You observed theirs. The effect doesn't just warp memory. It shapes prediction. You think you'll remember to do something later, so you don't write it down. You forget. You assume you'll have time to finish a task because you're underestimating how long your part will take and overestimating how quickly others will finish theirs. Deadlines slip. You believe you'll stick to a plan because your past successes feel more salient than your past failures. The plan falls apart, and it distorts how you see conflict. In an argument, you remember what you said, how you felt, what you were reacting to. The other person's experience is less vivid. So when you replay the fight, you see yourself as reasonable and them as overreacting. They're doing the same thing in reverse. Both of you are anchored to your own perspective, each convinced the other one escalated, each certain you were just responding. What makes egocentric bias tricky is that it's not about selfishness. You're not inflating your role to look good. You're just seeing clearly from where you stand and dimly from everywhere else. The bias doesn't make you dishonest. It makes you genuinely wrong about something that feels impossible to be wrong about your own contribution. The more involved you are, the stronger the bias. The more effort you put in, the more distorted your sense of proportion becomes. You're not lying when you say you did most of the work. You're just counting from a position where your work is the only work you fully see. Third-person effect. Advertising works. You know it does. Billions spent every year wouldn't exist if it didn't, but it doesn't work on you. You're too aware, too critical, too smart to fall for obvious manipulation. Other people, though, they're influenced, persuaded, swayed by the exact tactics you see right through. That certainty, the belief that you're immune to influence while others are vulnerable, is the third-person effect. It's the conviction that media, persuasion, and bias affect other people more than they affect you. You see yourself as the exception. Everyone else is the rule. The effect shows up constantly. You think propaganda sways others but not you. You believe you're less influenced by social media algorithms than your peers. Your certain advertising doesn't change your purchasing decisions even as you buy the brands you've been exposed to most. The influence is invisible to you because you experience your choices as rational, informed, independent. Other people's choices look more susceptible because you can see the external forces shaping them. You can't see the same forces shaping yours. And it's not just media. You think peer pressure affects others more than you. You believe you're less swayed by authority, less influenced by social proof, less vulnerable to emotional manipulation. When someone else changes their opinion after a conversation, they were persuaded. When you do it, you are presented with better information. The difference feels real. It's not. The bias creates a strange blind spot. You're vigilant about influence on others while being completely unaware of influence on yourself. You critique how media shapes public opinion while consuming the same media and assuming you're processing it objectively. You warn others about manipulation tactics you're equally vulnerable to. The third-person effect doesn't make you immune. It just makes you think you are. And it distorts how you engage with information. You're more skeptical of sources that challenge your views because you assume they're trying to manipulate you. You're less skeptical of sources that confirm what you already think because those feel like neutral truth. The asymmetry isn't about being discerning. It's about protecting your sense of independence while quietly conforming to the same influences everyone else is subject to. The effect also fuels overconfidence in debates. You think you're arguing from a position of clear reasoning while your opponent is trapped in bias. They think the exact same thing about you. Both of you are certain you're seeing clearly and the other is clouded. The third-person effect doesn't reveal who's actually right. It just makes everyone believe they are. What makes it insidious is how invisible it is. You can't feel yourself being influenced. Influence doesn't announce itself. It just shifts what feels obvious, what seems reasonable, what looks like common sense. And because you can't see it happening, you assume it isn't. Other people are the ones being shaped. You're just responding to reality. The effect doesn't protect you from influence. It just makes sure you never notice when it's working. Bias blind spot. You're aware of cognitive biases. You know people fall into predictable traps. Confirmation bias, groupthink, motivated reasoning. You see it everywhere. In your coworkers, your friends, strangers online. They're making obvious errors, filtering information to fit their beliefs, missing what's right in front of them. You, though. You're different. You're aware of these traps, so you avoid them. You think critically. You check your assumptions. You're not immune to bias, but you're certainly less affected than most people. That conviction, the belief that you're less biased than others, is itself a bias. And it might be the most stubborn one of all. The bias blind spot is the tendency to recognize bias in others while remaining blind to it in yourself. You see clearly how other people's judgments are distorted. Your own feel rational, grounded, objective. The asymmetry isn't a sign you're actually less biased. It's a sign the bias is working exactly as designed. The blind spot operates on a simple mechanism. When you make a decision, you have full access to your reasoning. You know why you think what you think. The process feels transparent, logical, sound. But when someone else reaches a different conclusion, you don't have that same access. You see the outcome, not the reasoning. So you fill the gap with an assumption. They must be biased. Their conclusion doesn't match yours, and since yours feels objective, theirs must be distorted. The effect shows up everywhere. You think you evaluate evidence fairly while others cherry-pick data. You believe you're open to changing your mind while others are entrenched. You're certain your political views are based on facts while the other side is driven by emotion or ideology. The pattern holds regardless of where you stand. Everyone thinks they're the reasonable one. Everyone thinks bias is something that happens to other people. And the more you know about bias, the worse it gets. Learning about cognitive traps doesn't make you less susceptible. It makes you more confident you're avoiding them. You can list a dozen biases by name, explain how they work, spot them in others. But that knowledge doesn't translate into self-awareness. It translates into certainty that you're the exception. The blind spot deepens the more informed you become. What makes it dangerous is how it shuts down self-correction. If you believe you're already accounting for bias, you stop checking. You don't question your assumptions because you're confident they're sound. You don't seek out opposing views because you're sure you've already considered them fairly. The blind spot doesn't just hide your biases. It convinces you they don't exist. And it makes disagreement unsolvable. When you're certain you're seeing clearly and they're seeing through distortion, there's no common ground. You're not debating ideas. You're debating whose perception is trustworthy. And since everyone believes theirs is, the conversation goes nowhere. The bias blind spot doesn't reveal who's actually right. It just makes everyone certain it's them. The truth is simpler and harder to accept. You're just as biased as everyone else. The clarity you feel, the objectivity you're sure you have, that's the bias talking. And the moment you're certain you've escaped it is the moment it has you most completely. Attribution substitution. Someone asks you a complicated question. How happy are you with your life overall? It's broad, abstract, hard to pin down. But you answer quickly. You don't realize you've just done something your mind does constantly, swapped a hard question for an easier one. Instead of evaluating your entire life, you think about how you're feeling right now. If you're in a good mood, life seems good. If you're frustrated, life seems frustrating. The substitution happens so fast you don't notice. You think you answered the question you were asked. You didn't. You answered a simpler version your brain generated on the spot. This automatic swap, replacing a difficult judgment with an easier one, is attribution substitution. When faced with complexity, your mind reeks for simplicity. It doesn't tell you it's doing this. It just delivers an answer that feels right. And because the answer feels right, you trust it, even though it's responding to the wrong question. The mechanism is efficient. Your brain is constantly handling more information than it can process consciously. So it takes shortcuts. When something is hard to evaluate directly, it finds a proxy. Something easier to assess that feels related. The substitution happens below awareness. By the time the answer reaches your conscious mind, it's already been swapped. It shows up everywhere. You're asked if someone is trustworthy. Instead of analyzing their track record, you assess how confident they seem. Confidence is easier to read than trustworthy, so you substitute. A politician asks for your vote. Instead of evaluating their policy positions in detail, you judge how much you like them personally. Likability is simpler than policy analysis. The substitution feels natural. You think you're making an informed choice. You're making an easy one. In hiring, it happens constantly. You're supposed to assess whether a candidate can do the job. Instead, you evaluate how similar they are to people you've worked with successfully before. Similarity is immediate. Job capability requires deeper analysis. So the substitution wins. You hire based on resemblance, convince yourself it was merit, and never realize you answered a different question than the one you thought you were asking. The effect doesn't just simplify hard questions. It makes you confident in answers that don't actually address what was asked. You feel certain about judgments that are based on substitutions you never noticed. The confidence is real. The foundation is shaky. And because the substitution is automatic, you can't easily stop it. You can know it's happening in general and still fall into it in specific cases. Your mind is faster than your awareness. By the time you're conscious of your answer, the swap has already occurred. The hard question was replaced. The easy answer was delivered. And you're left with a judgment that feels solid but was built on something much simpler than you realize. Attribution substitution doesn't make you wrong every time. Sometimes the easy question is a decent proxy for the hard one. But often it's not. And you won't know the difference because the substitution hides itself. You think you answered what was asked. You answered what was easy, and the gap between the two quietly undermines the judgment you were trying to make. Thin slicing. You meet someone for the first time. Within seconds, maybe less, you've formed an impression. Trustworthy or sketchy. Confident or insecure. Competent or struggling. You don't wait to gather evidence. You don't need a conversation. The judgment arrives fully formed, built from fragments so thin you barely noticed you were collecting them. A glance. A handshake. The way they stood. The tone in their greeting. Your mind processed it all, assembled a conclusion, and delivered it as certainty. And most of the time, you trust it. This rapid judgment from minimal information is thin slicing. It's your brain's ability to make sweeping assessments from narrow exposure. The slice is thin, sometimes just a few seconds, but the conclusions feel thick. Solid. Reliable. The mechanism works because your mind is built to detect patterns. It doesn't need the full picture to start forming conclusions. A few data points, a brief interaction, and pattern matching kicks in. You've seen enough people, enough situations, that your brain has templates ready. When something fits a template, the judgment fires instantly. And sometimes it's right. Thin slicing can be accurate. Experienced doctors diagnose conditions from brief observations. Skilled negotiators read the room in seconds. The mind's ability to extract signal from noise is real. But the accuracy is inconsistent. The problem is that thin slicing feels equally confident whether it's right or wrong. You meet someone who reminds you of an old colleague. Without realizing it, you transfer traits. The new person seems disorganized because the old one was. They haven't done anything to earn that judgment. But the template loaded, and now you're seeing them through a filter built from someone else entirely. Or you catch someone on a bad day. They're stressed, distracted, not themselves. But you don't know that. You thin slice from what's in front of you. The impression sticks. Later, even when they're more relaxed, more present, the initial judgment lingers. You thin sliced a moment and treated it like a truth. The effect compounds in high-stakes situations. Job interviews are thin slicing competitions. Candidates have minutes to make an impression. Interviewers thin slice from resumes, handshakes, answers to a few questions. Both sides are making sweeping judgments from narrow windows. And those judgments often determine outcomes that last years. What makes thin slicing dangerous is how invisible it is. You don't experience it as guessing. It feels like insight. The judgment arrives with conviction, as if you've seen something others might miss. But you haven't seen more. You've just decided faster. The confidence tricks you. You think you're reading people well when you're often just reading the first impression and mistaking it for the whole story. Thin slicing gives you speed. But speed isn't the same as accuracy. And the thinner the slice, the more likely you are to be wrong while feeling certain you're right. Effect heuristic. How do you feel about nuclear power? If the question makes you uneasy, you probably think it's risky and not particularly beneficial. If it sounds promising, you likely see it as safe and worthwhile. Your feelings came first. The risk assessment followed. That's backwards from how you think you're reasoning. You believe you evaluate the risks, weigh the benefits, then form an opinion. But that's not how it works. You feel something first, then your rational mind assembles an explanation that matches the feeling. This reliance on emotion to guide judgment is the effect heuristic. Instead of analyzing information carefully, you check how something makes you feel. If it feels good, it must be safe, beneficial, worthwhile. If it feels bad, it must be dangerous, harmful, avoidable. The feeling becomes the answer. The shortcut works because emotions are fast. They don't require analysis. You don't have to think through probabilities, trade-offs, evidence. You just feel. And the feeling gives you direction immediately. Like or dislike. Safe or dangerous. Good or bad. The heuristic substitutes emotional response for careful evaluation. And it shows up constantly. You trust someone because they feel trustworthy, not because you've verified their track record. You avoid an investment because it feels risky, not because you've analyzed the actual risk. You support a policy because it feels right, not because you've examined the evidence for whether it works. The effect came first. The reasoning came after, built to justify what you already felt. The heuristic doesn't just guide small decisions. It shapes major ones. People evaluate technologies, medical treatments, political positions, all filtered through how those things make them feel. If something triggers positive emotion, the benefits seem larger and the risks seem smaller. If it triggers negative emotion, the pattern reverses. Same information, different feelings, opposite conclusions. What makes it insidious is how it disguises itself as logic. You're not aware you're reasoning from emotion. You experience your conclusion as thoughtful, balanced, grounded in facts. But the facts were selected to support the feeling, not the other way around. The effect heuristic doesn't announce itself. It just quietly steers the analysis toward whatever confirms the emotion you started with. and it makes disagreements harder to resolve. When two people feel differently about the same thing, they'll interpret the same evidence in opposite ways. One person's risk is another's opportunity. One person's progress is another's threat. The gap isn't in the data. It's in the feeling the data triggers. And because the feeling came first, no amount of evidence will close it. The effect heuristic isn't always wrong. Emotions carry information. They can signal things your conscious mind hasn't processed yet. But when you let feeling replace analysis, you're not making better decisions. You're just making faster ones. And fast isn't the same as right. Availability heuristic. Which is more common, deaths from shark attacks or deaths from falling airplane parts? Most people say shark attacks. The actual answer: falling airplane parts. By a lot. The error happens because shark attacks are memorable, dramatic, easy to recall. Airplane parts falling from the sky. It happens, but it doesn't make headlines. You can't easily bring an example to mind, so your brain assumes it's rare. The easier something is to remember, the more common it feels. This reliance on mental availability to judge frequency is the availability heuristic. Your mind estimates how often something happens based on how easily examples come to mind. If you can think of instances quickly, it must happen a lot. If you struggle to recall examples, it must be uncommon. The logic feels sound. The execution is deeply flawed. The heuristic works because memory isn't neutral. It prioritizes vividness, recency, and emotional impact. Dramatic events stick. Routine ones fade. So when you try to estimate risk, your brain reeks for what's memorable, not what's actual. A plane crash gets replayed for weeks. Thousands of safe flights don't register. The availability of the crash warps your sense of how dangerous flying is. And it shapes decisions constantly. You overestimate the risk of terrorism because attacks are vivid and widely covered. You underestimate the risk of heart disease because it's common and unglamorous. The actual numbers say heart disease is a far bigger threat. But terrorism is more available in memory, so it feels more dangerous. The effect compounds with personal experience. If you know someone who got food poisoning from a specific restaurant, that restaurant feels risky even if thousands of people eat there safely. The one bad outcome is available. The countless fine outcomes aren't. So you avoid a place that's statistically safe because your memory made the risk feel larger than it is. It also distorts how you see social patterns. You think crime is rising because news coverage is constant. Crime rates might be falling, but availability doesn't track statistics. It tracks what you've seen recently. A few high-profile incidents make the problem feel epidemic even when the trend is moving the opposite direction. And in relationships, it skews perception. You remember the fights more than the calm days. The availability of conflict makes the relationship feel worse than it is. Or you remember a friend's unreliability more than their consistency. The few times they flaked stick. The many times they showed up fade. The imbalance warps how you see them. What makes the availability heuristic tricky is that it feels like you're being informed by experience. You are, but experience isn't a representative sample. It's a biased one, skewed toward whatever was memorable. And memorable doesn't mean common. It just means it's stuck. The heuristic confuses vividness with frequency. And that confusion makes you wrong about risks you think you understand. Representativeness heuristic. You're at a conference. You meet someone who's quiet, detail-oriented, loves puzzles and logic problems. What's their profession? Most people guess engineer or scientist. Barely anyone guesses elementary school teacher, even though there are far more teachers than engineers. The error happens because the description fits the stereotype of an engineer better than a teacher. It feels representative. So your mind goes with the match, ignoring the base rates entirely. Engineers might fit the description more often, but teachers vastly outnumber them. The math says teacher is the safer bet. Your intuition says engineer, and intuition wins. This reliance on how well something matches a category, ignoring how common the category actually is the representativeness heuristic. Your brain judges probability based on similarity. If something looks like it belongs to a group, it probably does. The heuristic works fast. It just works wrong. The pattern plays out everywhere. You meet someone wearing a suit, and you assume they work in finance. Maybe they do. But there are plenty of other professions where people wear suits. The match feels strong, so you stop thinking about alternatives. The representativeness heuristic delivered an answer. You didn't check if the answer was likely. It shows up in hiring constantly. A candidate reminds you of a successful employee. Same background, same demeanor, same way of talking. They feel like a good fit. So you hire them ignoring that the match might be surface level. The new person might lack the skills that made the original employee successful. But they looked the part, and that was enough. The heuristic also fuels stereotypes. You see someone who fits a group stereotype and assume they belong to it. The fit feels right, so you don't question it. You don't ask if the stereotype is even accurate, or how many exceptions exist, or whether this specific person actually matches beyond the surface. The representativeness was enough to trigger the conclusion. And it distorts how you interpret randomness. You flip a coin 5 times. It comes up heads every time. You assume tails is due next. But the coin doesn't know what happened before. Each flip is independent. The streak of heads feels non-representative of randomness, so your brain expects a correction. It's looking for a pattern that isn't there. The heuristic made you see meaning in noise. What makes it dangerous is how confident it makes you. When something fits a category well, the match feels obvious. You're not guessing. You're recognizing. But recognition based on similarity isn't the same as accuracy based on probability. The person who fits the engineer stereotype might be a teacher. The candidate who reminds you of your best hire might be your worst. The representativeness heuristic gives you a fast answer. But it's answering the wrong question. It's telling you what something looks like, not what it's likely to be. Implicit personality theory. Someone is warm and friendly. Without thinking, you also assume they're trustworthy, generous, probably good at their job. You didn't learn these things. You inferred them. One trait suggested a cluster of others. The package came pre-assembled in your mind. Or someone seems cold and distant. Now you assume they're probably selfish, harsh, maybe not very competent. Again, you have no evidence, but the traits feel connected. Coldness implies other negatives. The theory built itself automatically. These automatic assumptions about which personality traits go together form your implicit personality theory. It's the mental map you carry about how characteristics cluster. If someone has trait A, they probably have traits B and C too. The theory isn't based on data. It's based on associations your mind has built over time. And it runs constantly, filling in blanks you didn't realize were there. The pattern works because your brain builds coherence from incomplete information. You meet someone and get a few data points. But you don't leave the rest blank. You fill them in. The filling follows whatever template your implicit theory provides. Confident people must also be competent. Quiet people must also be thoughtful. The connections feel natural because your mind has been making them for years. And the theories vary by person. Your implicit theory about how traits connect might differ completely from someone else's. You might think intelligence and warmth go together. Someone else might think they're opposites. Neither theory is right. But both feel true to the person holding it, and both shape how you see everyone you meet. The effect shows up in first impressions. You notice someone is articulate, and suddenly you also assume they're organized, reliable, probably successful. The traits weren't demonstrated. They were inferred. Your implicit theory connected the dots. And now you're seeing a person partly from reality and partly from your own template. It also shapes how you interpret behavior. Someone who fits your warm template makes a mistake, and you assume it was an accident. Someone who fits your cold template makes the same mistake, and you assume it was carelessness. The behavior was identical, but your implicit theory about who they are changed how you explained what they did. What makes implicit personality theories problematic is how invisible they are. You don't realize you're filling in gaps. You think you're observing. You met someone friendly and noticed they're also generous. But you didn't notice that. You inferred it. The theory ran automatically, delivered conclusions, and you experienced those conclusions as observations. And the theories are sticky. Once you've decided someone is a certain type, contradicting information gets ignored or reinterpreted. They act out of character, and you treat it as the exception. They fit the character, and it confirms the theory. The implicit map you built becomes the lens through which everything they do gets filtered. You're not seeing the person anymore. You're seeing your theory of who people like them are supposed to be. Confirmation bias. You believe something. Maybe it's a political view, opinion about a coworker, a sense that a decision was right. Now watch what happens to new information, evidence that supports your belief. It gets noticed, remembered, weighted heavily. Evidence that contradicts it. Overlooked, forgotten, explained away. You're not doing this consciously, but the pattern is relentless. Your mind is filtering reality to protect what you already think. This tendency to seek, interpret, and remember information that confirms existing beliefs is confirmation bias. It's not just that you prefer evidence that agrees with you. It's that you process agreeing evidence and disagreeing evidence through completely different systems. One gets amplified. The other gets dismissed. The bias works in stages. First, you seek confirmation. If you think a colleague is unreliable, you notice the times they're late, the emails they miss, the moments they drop the ball. You're not tracking the times they show up, deliver on time, follow through. Those don't fit what you're looking for, so they don't register. Then you interpret ambiguously. The colleague sends a short email. If you think they're unreliable, the brevity feels like carelessness. If you thought they were efficient, the same email would read as concise. The behavior didn't change. Your belief changed how you read it. Finally, you remember selectively. Later, when you think back on this colleague, the late arrivals come to mind easily. The on-time days fade. The pattern you remember isn't the pattern that happened. It's the pattern your confirmation bias built, filtering out anything that didn't fit. And it doesn't just protect beliefs. It entrenches them. The more you filter information through confirmation bias, the more evidence you accumulate for what you already think. The belief gets stronger not because it's more accurate, but because you've built a one-sided case for it. You're prosecuting, not investigating. The bias shows up everywhere. You believe a diet works, so you notice when you lose weight and ignore when you don't. You think a stock will rise, so you focus on positive news and downplay warnings. You're convinced a relationship is solid, so you see care in every gesture and miss the signs of distance. The belief shapes the evidence. The evidence reinforces the belief. The loop closes. What makes confirmation bias powerful is that it feels like objectivity. You're not ignoring evidence. You're evaluating it, but the evaluation is rigged. Anything that agrees feels strong, clear, convincing. Anything that disagrees feels weak, flawed, irrelevant. You're not weighing information fairly. You're sorting it into what supports you and what doesn't, then only counting one side. And it makes changing your mind nearly impossible. To update a belief, you'd need to notice disconfirming evidence. But confirmation bias ensures you don't. The evidence is there. You're just not seeing it. Or you're seeing it and explaining it away. The bias doesn't protect you from being wrong. It protects you from realizing you're wrong. and that protection keeps the error locked in place indefinitely. Primacy Effect. First impressions stick. You know this already. But what you might not realize is how completely that first piece of information dominates everything that follows. You meet someone who seems cold in the first 30 seconds. Later, they're warm, engaged, helpful. But that initial coldness lingers. It colors how you interpret the warmth. Maybe they're just being polite. Maybe they want something. The first impression created a frame, and now everything gets filtered through it. Or you read a performance review. The opening line is critical. The rest is balanced, even positive in places. But when you think back on the review later, what you remember is the criticism. It came first. It set the tone. Everything after had to fight a pill against that initial framing. This outsized influence of first information is the primacy effect. What comes first doesn't just get noticed. It gets weighted more heavily than everything that follows. The beginning shapes the interpretation of the middle and the end. Order matters more than content. The effect works because first information creates context. Your mind uses early data to build a framework. Once that framework exists, new information gets slotted into it. If the framework says, "This person is unfriendly," then friendly behavior gets reinterpreted. They're not actually warm. They're compensating or faking or being strategic. The primacy effect doesn't just set an impression. It defends that impression against updates. And it shows up everywhere. In presentations, the opening argument carries disproportionate weight. If you start weak, the audience rates the entire presentation lower, even if you finish strong. In negotiations, the first offer anchors the discussion. Everything after is a response to that opening position. In relationships, early conflicts or disappointments create narratives that are hard to rewrite, even when the pattern changes. The primacy effect also explains why false information is so hard to correct. Once someone hears a claim, it becomes their baseline. Even if they later learn it's wrong, the original claim still influences their thinking. The correction arrives second. It has to dislodge what came first. And first information digs in deeper. What makes the effect powerful is how invisible it is. You don't feel like you're overweighting the beginning. You feel like you're tracking the whole picture. But when you replay the interaction in your head, the early moments are sharper, more detailed, more influential. The primacy effect isn't changing what happened. It's changing what you remember and how much it matters. The beginning doesn't just set the stage. It writes the script for everything that follows. And once that script is running, revising it takes far more effort than writing it did in the first place. Recency Effect. What's the last thing someone said to you in a conversation? You probably remember it clearly. What did they say in the middle? Hazia. Much harder to recall. This pattern, remembering the end better than the middle, is the recency effect. The most recent information gets weighted more heavily because it's still active in your mind. It hasn't faded yet. So when you make a judgment, the recent stuff dominates, even if earlier information was more important. The effect shows up in decisions constantly. You're evaluating job candidates. You interview 5 people in one day. The last candidate has an advantage. They're fresh in your memory. Their answers feel sharper, their presence more vivid. The earlier candidates have started to blur together. The recency effect makes the timing of the interview matter as much as the quality of it. Or you're in a long meeting. Multiple proposals get discussed. When it's time to vote, people lean toward whatever was discussed most recently. Not because it was the best option. Because it's the most available in memory. The earlier proposals had merit. But they've already started fading. Recency wins by default. The pattern also shapes how you remember relationships. A fight that happened yesterday feels more defining than months of calm. A recent kindness outweighs past distance. Your sense of how things are going isn't based on the overall pattern. It's based on what's happened lately. The recency effect makes the present feel like the whole story, and it distorts performance evaluation. An employee has a strong year but stumbles in the last quarter. The recent struggle dominates the annual review. Managers remember what's fresh. The earlier successes, even if they were more substantial, get less weight because they've faded from immediate recall. What makes the recency effect tricky is that it feels like you're being current, staying focused on what matters now. But recent isn't the same as representative. The last thing that happened might be an outlier. It might not reflect the pattern at all. But because it's recent, it feels more true, more relevant, more predictive what comes next. The recency effect doesn't just emphasize the end. It lets the end rewrite the middle. What happened last becomes what happened overall. And the longer story, the one that includes everything that came before, quietly disappears from the judgment. Framing effect. Same facts, different presentation, completely different reaction. A medical treatment has a 90% survival rate. Sounds promising. You'd probably consider it. The same treatment has a 10% mortality rate. Now it sounds riskier. You might hesitate. The numbers are identical. The frame changed. And the frame changed your response. This sensitivity to how information is presented, not just what information is presented, is the framing effect. Your mind doesn't process facts in a vacuum. It processes them in context. And the context, the frame, shapes how the facts feel. Positive framing makes the same outcome feel better. Negative framing makes it feel worse. The effect works because your brain is wired to respond to patterns, not absolutes. 90% survival triggers associations with success, safety, high odds. 10% mortality triggers associations with danger, loss, risk. Logically, they're the same. Emotionally, they're opposite. And decisions aren't made logically. They're made emotionally, then justified logically after. Framing shows up everywhere. In politics, the same policy gets described as tax relief by supporters and tax cuts for the wealthy by opponents. Both frames refer to the same thing. But relief sounds like fixing a problem. Cuts for the wealthy sounds like unfairness. The frame isn't changing the policy. It's changing how you feel about it. At work, framing shapes how feedback lands. You need to improve your communication skills. Feels like criticism. Developing stronger communication skills will help you advance. Feels like opportunity. Same message. Different frame. One makes you defensive. The other makes you motivated. And in marketing, framing is everything. 80% lean. Sounds healthier than 20% fat. Limited time offer creates urgency that available now doesn't. Join thousands of satisfied customers. Feels safer than try our product. The frames aren't lying. They're just highlighting certain aspects and hiding others. And those choices steer your response. What makes framing powerful is that it doesn't feel like manipulation. You think you're responding to the information. You are. But the information was pre-shaped to guide that response. The frame selected what to emphasize, what to downplay, what words to use. By the time the information reaches you, it's already been optimized to trigger a specific reaction. And because you can't easily separate the frame from the content, you can't easily resist it. The facts and the framing arrive together. You process them as a package. And the package was designed to make you feel a certain way. The framing effect doesn't change what's true. It changes what feels true. And feeling drives the choice. Contrast effect. You test drive a decent car. It's fine. Comfortable, reliable, nothing special. Then you test drive a terrible one. Loud, uncomfortable, barely functional. Now you go back to the first car. Suddenly it feels great. Nothing about the car changed. But the contrast made it seem better. This shift in evaluation based on comparison is the contrast effect. Your judgment of something isn't absolute. It's relative. When you see it next to something worse, it looks better. When you see it next to something better, it looks worse. The thing itself hasn't changed. Your reference point has. The effect works because your mind doesn't have fixed internal standards for most things. It builds judgments on the fly, using whatever's nearby as a baseline. If the baseline is low, everything else gets elevated. If the baseline is high, everything else gets diminished. You think you're evaluating the thing in front of you. You're evaluating it against the last thing you saw, and it shapes decisions constantly. You look at apartments. The first one is overpriced and cramped. The second one is just okay, but after the first, it feels spacious and reasonable. You might rent it. If you'd seen it first, you might have passed. The contrast made the difference. In salary negotiations, the contrast effect is a weapon. An employer offers you a low number first. Your counteroffer feels high by comparison. If they'd opened higher, your counteroffer would have been higher too. The opening created a contrast that pulled your expectations down. The effect also distorts how you see people. You meet someone after interacting with someone difficult. The new person seems pleasant, easy to work with, even if they're just average. The contrast made them stand out. If you'd met them in a different order, they wouldn't have seemed remarkable at all. And it works in reverse. You're having a good day. Then someone gives you neutral feedback. It feels harsh. If you'd been having a rough day, the same feedback might have felt generous. The contrast between your mood and the feedback changed how the feedback landed. The words were the same. The gap was different. What makes the contrast effect dangerous is how arbitrary it is. Your judgment shifts based on accidents of sequence. What you saw first. What you're comparing against. None of that has anything to do with the actual quality of what you're evaluating. But it changes your rating dramatically. You think you're being consistent. You're just being relative. And relative means your evaluation is as much about the context as it is about the thing itself. Anchoring effect. A house is listed for $800,000. You think that's too high. You offer $700. You negotiate. You settle at $750. You feel like you got a deal. But what if the house was worth $600? The listing price anchored your sense of value. Everything after was calculated from that anchor. You didn't evaluate the house on its own terms. You evaluated it against the number you saw first. And that number, even though you knew it was inflated, pulled your entire range upward. This tendency for initial numbers to shape all subsequent judgments is the anchoring effect. Once an anchor is set, even if it's arbitrary, even if you know it's wrong, it still influences where you land. You adjust from the anchor, but you don't adjust enough. The anchor keeps you tethered to a range you might never have considered otherwise. The effect works because your mind uses starting points as reference frames. When you see a number, any number, your brain treats it as information. Even if the number is random, even if it's irrelevant, it creates a baseline. And baselines are sticky. You move away from them, but not far. The anchor holds more weight than it should. And it shows up everywhere. In stores, the original price is crossed out and the sale price is displayed. The original price is the anchor. The sale feels like savings, even if the original price was inflated to make the sale look better. You're anchored to a number that was designed to manipulate your sense of value. In negotiations, the first number thrown out sets the range. If someone opens high, your counteroffer will be higher than if they'd opened low. You're adjusting from their anchor. Even if you think you're being independent, the anchor shaped your response. Studies show this works even with absurd anchors. The number still pulls. At work, salary discussions get anchored by your previous pay. You're offered a raise based on what you currently make, not what the role is worth. The anchor keeps your expectations tied to your past, not the market. If you'd started higher, You'd be negotiating from a higher point. The anchor doesn't just set the floor. It sets the ceiling. What makes anchoring insidious is that knowing about it doesn't protect you. You can be fully aware that a number is just an anchor, and it will still affect your judgment. The effect operates below conscious control. The anchor gets processed, compared against, used as a reference point, all before you consciously decide what's fair. The first number you hear isn't just information. It's a constraint. And even if you try to ignore it, even if you adjust away from it, you're still moving within the boundaries it created. The anchoring effect doesn't tell you what to think. It just makes sure you start thinking from a position that benefits whoever set the anchor. Mere exposure effect. There's a song you didn't like the first time you heard it. Then you heard it again, and again. Somewhere along the way it grew on you. Now you kind of enjoy it. Nothing about the song changed. You just got used to it. Or there's a coworker you found annoying at first. Abrasive, too opinionated, hard to work with. But over time, as you kept running into them, the irritation faded. They started seeming more reasonable, even likable. They didn't change their behavior. You just saw them enough times that familiarity softened the edges. This tendency to prefer things simply because you've been exposed to them repeatedly is the mere exposure effect. Familiarity breeds liking. Not always, but more often than you'd expect. The more you encounter something, the more positively you feel about it, even if the thing itself hasn't done anything to earn that preference. The effect works because repeated exposure signals safety. Evolutionarily, if you've encountered something multiple times and it hasn't hurt you, it's probably not a threat. Your mind treats familiarity as evidence of harmlessness. And harmlessness, over time, starts to feel like appeal. The preference isn't based on quality. It's based on repetition. And it shapes preferences constantly. Brands spend billions on advertising, not to convince you their product is better, but just to make sure you see their name over and over. The repetition alone increases the odds you'll choose them. You think you're picking based on merit. You're picking based on recognition. And recognition came from exposure, not evaluation. The effect shows up in social dynamics too. People who sit near each other in class or at work tend to become friends, not because proximity creates compatibility, but because repeated exposure increases liking. You see someone regularly, and that regularity makes them feel more familiar, more comfortable, more trustworthy. The mere exposure effect turns proximity into preference. And it explains why change feels uncomfortable. New systems, new routines, new people, they all trigger resistance. Not because they're worse. Because they're unfamiliar. The old way feels better simply because you've been exposed to it longer. The preference isn't about effectiveness. It's about repetition. Once the new thing becomes familiar, the preference flips. What makes the mere exposure effect subtle is that it doesn't announce itself. You don't think, I like this because I've seen it a lot. You just think, I like this. The repetition did its work quietly, below awareness. By the time you're conscious of the preference, you've already forgotten how it formed. The mere exposure effect doesn't you like everything you see repeatedly. Extreme annoyances can override it, but for neutral or mildly negative things, repetition is enough to shift them toward positive. Familiarity doesn't just reduce fear, it generates preference. And that preference feels like a judgment of quality, when it's really just a response to frequency. Social proof. The restaurant is packed. There's a line out the door. You weren't planning to eat there, but now you're curious. If that many people are waiting, it must be good. You join the line. Or you're scrolling online reviews. One product has thousands of ratings. Another has 12. Both have similar scores. You pick the one with thousands. Not because the reviews are better, because the crowd chose it. And the crowd, you assume, knows something you don't. This reliance on what others are doing to guide your own choices is social proof. When you're uncertain, you look around. You see what everyone else is choosing, and you assume their choice reflects good judgment. The bigger the crowd, the stronger the signal. If everyone's doing it, it must be right. The pattern works because individual judgment is expensive. Evaluating every option from scratch takes time, effort, research. Social proof offers a shortcut. Let the crowd do the evaluation, then follow. It's efficient, and often it works. Crowds do aggregate information. Popular things are often popular for a reason, but the shortcut has a flaw. Crowds don't always choose well. Sometimes everyone's following everyone else, and no one actually evaluated the thing independently. The restaurant might be packed because one review went viral, not because the food is exceptional. The product might have thousands of ratings because it's been around longer, not because it's better. You're following a signal that might be noise. And social proof compounds. Once something becomes popular, popularity itself becomes the reason to choose it. You see a long line and join it. Your presence makes the line longer. Someone else sees the even longer line and joins. Now the signal is even stronger, built entirely on itself. The crowd grows not because the thing is worth it, but because the crowd existed in the first place. The effect shows up everywhere. Fashion trends, investment bubbles, viral content. They don't spread because of inherent value. They spread because visibility creates more visibility. Social proof turns momentum into evidence. And once the momentum starts, it's hard to tell whether the thing driving it is actually good or just benefiting from the feedback loop. What makes social proof dangerous is how it disguises itself as wisdom. You think you're tapping into collective knowledge. Sometimes you are. But often you're just following a crowd that's following a crowd. No one's steering. Everyone's just assuming someone else knows where this is going. And by the time you realize the crowd was wrong, you're already in the middle of it. Bandwagon Effect. A candidate is surging in the polls. Suddenly, people who were undecided start supporting them. Not because the candidate's platform changed. Because winning feels inevitable. And people want to be on the winning side. Or a trend takes off. A phrase, a style, a way of doing things. At first, you ignore it. Then you see it everywhere. Your resistance fades. You start using it too. Not because you were convinced by arguments. Because enough people adopted it that staying out felt like being left behind. This tendency to adopt beliefs or behaviors because others are adopting them is the bandwagon effect. It's social proof with momentum. You don't just follow the crowd. You follow the crowd that's growing. And the growth itself becomes the reason to join. The effect works because humans are social. Being part of the group feels safe. Being outside it feels risky. When you see a movement gaining ground, joining it isn't just about agreeing with the movement. It's about not being isolated. The bandwagon offers belonging. And belonging is powerful enough to override independent judgment. And once you're on the bandwagon, you defend it. You didn't join because you were persuaded by evidence. You joined because it was growing. But admitting that feels uncomfortable. So you find reasons. You convince yourself the position makes sense. You construct arguments you didn't have before. The bandwagon effect doesn't just change behavior. It changes how you justify the behavior after the fact. The pattern shows up in markets. Stock prices rise. More people buy. The buying pushes prices higher. More people see the rise and buy in. The bandwagon builds itself. At some point, the price stops reflecting value and starts reflecting momentum. When the momentum breaks, the collapse is just as rapid. Everyone who joined for the ride scrambles to get off. It happens in workplaces too. A new initiative gains support. Managers who were skeptical start endorsing it. Not because new evidence emerged. Because opposition feels like being out of step. The bandwagon creates its own pressure. Disagreeing becomes harder as more people climb on. The effect silences doubt not by resolving it, but by making it socially costly to voice. What makes the bandwagon effect powerful is that it feels like consensus. You see widespread adoption and interpret it as validation. But widespread adoption might just mean the bandwagon started rolling and people didn't want to be left behind. The consensus you're joining isn't the result of collective evaluation. It's the result of collective momentum. And momentum doesn't care whether the direction is right. It just cares that it's moving. Illusory truth effect. You hear a claim once. It sounds questionable. You don't accept it, but it registers. A week later, you hear it again. This time, it sounds more familiar. A month later, someone repeats it. Now it feels true. Not because you verified it. Because you've heard it enough times that it stopped feeling new. This tendency for repeated statements to feel more accurate is the illusory truth effect. Repetition creates familiarity. Familiarity feels like truth. The claim doesn't need evidence. It just needs airtime. The more you hear it, the more real it seems, even if it was false from the start. The effect works because your brain uses fluency as a proxy for accuracy. When something is easy to process, when it flows smoothly through your mind, it feels right. Repetition makes processing easier. You've encountered the claim before. It's familiar. Familiar things process faster. And faster processing gets mistaken for truth. And the effect doesn't care whether you believed the claim initially. Even if you rejected it the first time, repetition wears down resistance. The third, fourth, fifth exposure don't present new evidence. They just make the claim feel less foreign. And less foreign starts to feel more plausible. You're not being convinced. You're being worn down by familiarity. The pattern shows up everywhere. Advertising repeats slogans until they feel like facts. Political messaging repeats talking points until they seem obvious. Misinformation spreads not because it's persuasive, but because it's persistent. The more times a false claim circulates, the more people start treating it as true. Not because they investigated, because they've seen it enough that it stopped triggering doubt. And correction doesn't fully reverse it. Once you've heard a claim repeatedly, even learning it's false doesn't erase the familiarity. The illusory truth effect leaves residue. The claim still feels more true than a claim you've never heard, even after you know it's wrong. The repetition created a fluency that persists independent of accuracy. What makes the illusory truth effect insidious is how passive it is. You don't have to believe the claim actively. You just have to hear it. The repetition does the work. And because the shift happens gradually, you don't notice you're treating something as more credible than you did before. The claim didn't get stronger. You just got used to it. And your mind confused that familiarity with validity. Status characteristics bias. Two people present the same idea in a meeting. One is senior, confident, well-dressed. The other is junior, less polished, newer to the team. The idea gets attributed to the senior person. Not because they presented it better, because status made their version sound more credible. Or you're listening to advice. One person has an impressive title, the other doesn't. The advice is identical. You weigh the titled person's words more heavily. Not because you evaluated the logic, because the title created an assumption. High status must mean high competence. The bias did the rest. This tendency to judge people's contributions based on their status rather than merit is status characteristics bias. Visible markers, rank, credentials, appearance, they all create expectations. And those expectations shape how you interpret everything that person says or does. High status gets the benefit of the doubt. Low status has to fight for it. The bias works because status is easy to read and merit is hard to evaluate. Judging an idea on its own terms requires thought. Judging it based on who said it is instant. Your brain takes the shortcut. If someone has status, they probably earned it. So their ideas probably have value. The logic feels sound. The execution is deeply flawed, and it shows up constantly. In hiring, candidates with prestigious backgrounds get rated higher for the same answers. In performance reviews, employees with senior titles get credited for successes and excused for failures. In collaborations, high-status voices dominate discussions, even when lower-status participants have better ideas. The bias doesn't just tilt judgments. It silences contributions before they're even heard. The effect compounds over time. People with status get more opportunities. Those opportunities lead to more success. The success reinforces the status. The loop closes. Meanwhile, people without status get overlooked. Fewer opportunities mean fewer wins. The lack of wins confirms the initial judgment that they weren't worth the opportunity. The bias becomes self-fulfilling. What makes status characteristics bias dangerous is how invisible it feels. You don't think you're favoring high-status people. You think you're recognizing quality, but the quality you're seeing is often just the halo of status. You're not evaluating the idea. You're evaluating the person's rank. And rank, while sometimes correlated with ability, is not the same thing. The bias mistakes the marker for the trait. And that mistake keeps talented people invisible while amplifying mediocre contributions from those who happen to have the right credentials. System justification. The system is broken. You can see it clearly. Policies that don't work. Structures that create harm. Inequalities that persist for no good reason. But when someone proposes change, you hesitate. Maybe the current system isn't perfect, but at least it's stable. At least it's predictable. Change feels risky. So you defend what's there, even when you know it's flawed. Or you're personally disadvantaged by how things work. The setup benefits others more than it benefits you. You could push for reform, but instead, you find yourself justifying the arrangement. It's fair. It's meritocratic. It's the way things should be. You're defending a system that's working against you, and you genuinely believe it. This tendency to rationalize and defend existing social arrangements, even when they're unjust, is system justification. It's the mind's preference for stability over fairness. Change is uncertain. The current system, however flawed, is known. So you justify it. You find reasons it makes sense. You downplay its problems. You resist alternatives. Not because you love the system, because defending it feels safer than dismantling it. The pattern works because uncertainty is uncomfortable. Systems provide structure. Even bad systems offer predictability. Tearing them down means navigating the unknown. Your mind resists that. It would rather rationalize the system than face the chaos of rebuilding. So it generates justifications. It tells you the system is fair or necessary or the best available option. The justifications protect you from the discomfort of wanting change. And the effect is stronger when you're disadvantaged. You'd expect people who suffer under a system to oppose it most. But system justification works in reverse. The more a system harms you, the more motivated you are to believe it's legitimate. Accepting that it's broken means accepting that your suffering is meaningless, that the game was rigged, that your efforts were wasted. Justifying the system lets you preserve a sense of control. If the system is fair, then your outcome reflects your choices. The pain becomes bearable because it feels earned. The pattern shows up in workplaces. Employees defend hierarchies that underpay them. They rationalize policies that limit their advancement. They resist reforms that would benefit them. Not because they're irrational, because acknowledging the system is unjust means confronting how much it's cost them. Justification is easier. It happens in politics too. People defend institutions that don't serve them. They oppose changes that would improve their lives. The system justification bias makes them protective of arrangements that harm them, simply because those arrangements exist. Familiarity breeds defense. And the defense doesn't require the system to be good. It just requires it to be there. What makes system justification troubling is how it locks in bad systems. The worse a system is, the more people it harms, the more those people are motivated to defend it. The bias doesn't fix problems. It rationalizes them. And the rationalization makes reform nearly impossible. You can't change a system people have convinced themselves is already fair. Dehumanization. You're stuck in traffic. Someone cuts you off. For a moment, they're not a person. They're an obstacle. Inconsiderate. Selfish. Barely worth thinking about beyond the annoyance they caused. You don't wonder if they're rushing to the hospital. You don't consider they might have made an honest mistake. You just see the action, strip away the humanity, and reduce them to the problem they created. Or you hear about a group you disagree with. Maybe it's political opponents, maybe it's people from a different background. You stop seeing them as individuals. They become a category, a type, a problem. You talk about them in ways you'd never talk about people you know personally. The distance makes it easy. The abstraction makes it safe. This process of stripping away someone's humanity, reducing them to something less than a full person, is dehumanization. It's the mind's way of simplifying. People are complex. Empathy is expensive. So when someone's not in your immediate circle, when they're abstract or distant or opposed to you, your mind takes a shortcut. It stops processing them as fully human. It treats them as objects, obstacles, or threats. The pattern works because empathy requires effort. You can't deeply consider every person you encounter. There aren't enough hours, so your brain rations empathy. People close to you get the full version. Strangers, opponents, outgroup members, they get the reduced version. You see their actions without seeing their context. You judge their behavior without considering their humanity. They become simplified. And once someone is dehumanized, cruelty becomes easier. You don't feel the same guilt dismissing them, insulting them, ignoring their suffering. They're not like you. They don't feel the same. They don't deserve the same consideration. The dehumanization creates permission. It's not that you want to be cruel. It's that the person stopped registering as someone cruelty could hurt. The effect shows up everywhere. Online, where anonymity and distance make dehumanization effortless. You say things to strangers you'd never say face to face. Not because the words are less harmful, because the person feels less real. In politics, where opponents get reduced to stereotypes, caricatures, threats. The dehumanization makes compromise impossible. You can't negotiate with people you've stopped seeing as people. And it escalates quietly. You start by dismissing their perspective. Then you dismiss their intelligence, then their character, then their worth. Each step feels justified by the last. By the time you're fully dehumanizing someone, you've built a narrative where they deserved it. The dehumanization doesn't feel like a bias. It feels like recognition of what they actually are. What makes dehumanization dangerous is how normal it feels. You don't think you're dehumanizing. You think you're being realistic, seeing people clearly, refusing to be naive. But the clarity you're experiencing is actually reduction. You're not seeing the person fully. You're seeing a simplified version your mind built to save effort. And that simplification, that reduction, is the exact mechanism that's always enabled the worst of human behavior. The cruelty doesn't start with malice. It starts with the quiet decision to stop seeing someone as fully human. And once that door opens, everything else follows. Attractiveness Stereotype. Someone walks into a room. They're good-looking, well put together. Before they say a word, you've already made assumptions. They're probably confident, likable, successful, trustworthy. You haven't gathered any evidence, but the assumptions are already running. Or you're choosing between candidates. One is more attractive than the other. Same credentials, same experience, but you lean toward the attractive one. Not consciously. You just have a better feeling about them. They seem more competent, more reliable. The attractiveness did something your conscious mind didn't notice. This automatic association between physical appearance and positive traits is the attractiveness stereotype. Good-looking people get credited with qualities they haven't demonstrated. They seem smarter, kinder, more capable. The stereotype runs so deep that it shapes outcomes. Attractive people get hired more, paid more, trusted more. Not because they perform better, because the assumption of quality came bundled with their appearance. The pattern works because your mind links unrelated things. Attractiveness signals health, symmetry, genetic fitness. Your brain evolved to notice those signals. But somewhere along the way, the association expanded. Attractive became good, and good became everything. Competent, honest, warm, intelligent. The halo spread from appearance to personality to ability. None of it earned. All of it assumed. And the stereotype operates invisibly. You don't decide to favor attractive people. You just process them differently. Their ideas sound better. Their mistakes get excused more easily. Their presence feels more pleasant. The bias doesn't announce itself. It just quietly tilts every interaction in their favor. The effect shows up everywhere. In courtrooms, attractive defendants receive lighter sentences. In classrooms, attractive students get rated as more intelligent. In workplaces, attractive employees advance faster. The advantage isn't small. It compounds over time. Every interaction, every judgment slightly skewed. The accumulation builds careers, shapes reputations, determines outcomes. And it works in reverse. Less attractive people face the opposite bias. They have to work harder to prove competence. They get interrupted more, listened to less, assumed to be less capable. The same performance gets rated lower. The same idea gets dismissed faster. The stereotype doesn't just elevate some people. It suppresses others. What makes the attractiveness stereotype powerful is how universal it is. Almost everyone runs it, and almost no one admits it. You think you're evaluating people fairly. You're not. Appearance is doing half the work before merit even enters the picture. The playing field isn't level. It never was. Expectation confirmation. You expect someone to be difficult. So when you interact with them, you're on guard, tense, a little cold. They pick up on it. They respond with distance. Now they seem difficult. Your expectation just confirmed itself. But it wasn't a prediction. It was a setup. Or you think a meeting will be unproductive. You show up with low energy, minimal engagement. Others notice. They dial back, too. The meeting drags. Nothing gets done. You leave thinking you were right. The meeting was a waste. But the expectation shaped the outcome. You didn't predict failure. You created it. This tendency for expectations to influence behavior in ways that make those expectations come true is expectation confirmation. You expect something. You act accordingly. Your actions nudge reality toward the expectation. Then you see the result and mistake it for validation. The expectation wasn't accurate. It was self-fulfilling. The mechanism is simple. Expectations shape attention. If you expect someone to be unreliable, you notice when they're late and ignore when they're on time. Expectations shape interpretation. The same behavior reads differently depending on what you expected. A late arrival from someone you trust feels like an exception. From someone you distrust, it feels like proof. And expectations shape behavior. You expect a colleague to underperform, so you don't give them challenging work. They don't get the chance to prove themselves. Their performance stays flat. You see the flat performance as confirmation they weren't capable. But the expectation limited the opportunity. The lack of opportunity confirmed the expectation. The pattern shows up constantly. Teachers expect certain students to struggle, so they give them less attention and easier material. those students fall behind. The gap confirms the expectation. The expectation created the gap. Managers expect certain employees to excel, so they invest more, mentor more, forgive mistakes. Those employees thrive. The success confirms the expectation. The expectation built the success. And it works in relationships. You expect a partner to be critical, so you're defensive. The defensiveness feels like hostility to them. They respond with actual criticism. Now your expectation is confirmed. But the criticism wouldn't have happened if the expectation hadn't triggered the defensiveness first. The loop closed on itself. What makes expectation confirmation dangerous is how it hides the mechanism. You see the outcome. You don't see how your expectation built it. The result feels like evidence your expectation was right all along. But the expectation didn't reveal the truth. It constructed the truth. And now the truth you created is the truth you're living with. Behavioral confirmation. You treat someone like they're unreliable. You double-check their work. You don't trust them with important tasks. You keep them at arm's length. Over time, they start acting unreliable. Not because they were unreliable to begin with. Because your treatment made it true. Or you assume someone is unfriendly. So you're distant. Formal. A little cold. They mirror it back. Now they seem unfriendly. But the unfriendliness wasn't there until you projected it. Your behavior toward them shaped their behavior toward you. Then you took their response as proof you were right from the start. This process, where your treatment of someone causes them to behave in ways that confirm your initial belief, is behavioral confirmation. You don't just expect something. You act on that expectation in ways that push the other person toward confirming it. The belief becomes a script. And you're directing both roles. The effect works because people respond to how they're treated. If you treat someone with suspicion, they become guarded. If you treat them with warmth, they open up. Your behavior sets the tone. Their response follows. Then you interpret their response as revealing who they really are. But you're not discovering their nature. You're eliciting a version of them that matches your expectation. And it happens without awareness. You don't realize you're treating people differently based on your assumptions. The differences are subtle. Tone of voice. Eye contact. How much space you give them to speak. How quickly you interrupt. How generously you interpret what they say. The adjustments are small. The impact is large. The pattern shows up everywhere. In hiring, interviewers who expect a candidate to be weak ask easier questions, give less time to answer, interpret responses less charitably. The candidate underperforms. The expectation confirmed, but the candidate wasn't given the same chance as someone the interviewer expected to be strong. In classrooms, teachers who expect certain students to excel call on them more, give them more time to think, praise their answers more enthusiastically. Those students gain confidence. They participate more. They perform better. The expectation was confirmed, but the teaching created the performance. And in relationships, if you expect someone to let you down, you're more distant, less invested, quicker to criticize. They feel the withdrawal. They pull back too. Now they're letting you down. The expectation didn't predict the outcome. It scripted it. And because you're living inside the script, you can't see the difference between prediction and production. Behavioral confirmation doesn't just prove you right. It traps both of you in a reality neither of you chose. You think you're responding to who they are. You're responding to who you expected them to be. And they're becoming that person, because that's the only role your behavior left open. Social identity bias. You're more likely to help someone who supports the same sports team. You trust people who share your political views more easily. You feel instant warmth toward someone who went to your school. None of these things should matter. But they do. Because identity isn't just about who you are. It's about who you're with. And the moment you identify someone as part of your group, the whole calculation changes. They're not just another person. They're one of yours. And that shifts everything. Social identity bias is the tendency to favor people who share group membership with you. It doesn't matter how trivial the group is. Same hometown, same profession, same taste in music. Once the shared identity clicks, you like them more, trust them more, help them more. The in-group gets preferential treatment. The out-group doesn't. The bias works because group membership signals alliance. Evolutionarily, your survival depended on your group. In-group members were safe. Out-group members were potential threats. Your brain still runs that calculation. When someone shares your identity, they get categorized as safe. That categorization unlocks trust, warmth, cooperation, or automatic, all below conscious thought. And it shows up in hiring, lending, criminal justice, everyday interactions. Resumers with names that sound like they belong to your group get rated higher. Loan applications from in-group members get approved more often. Defendants who share the judge's identity receive more lenient sentences. The bias doesn't need bigotry. It just needs the presence of group markers. The effect compounds in subtle ways. You give in-group members the benefit of the doubt. Out-group members have to earn it. You interpret ambiguous behavior from your group generously. The same behavior from the out-group reads as suspicious. You're solving for different assumptions based solely on whether someone feels like one of yours. And the groups don't have to be meaningful. Researchers have triggered social identity bias with completely arbitrary divisions. Red team versus blue team. Random assignment. No history. No stakes. Within minutes, people favor their own team, rate them as smarter, more trustworthy, more deserving. The content of the group didn't matter. The fact of belonging did. What makes social identity bias dangerous is how it masquerades as natural affinity. You think you just click better with certain people. You think you're recognizing quality. But the recognition is rigged. You're favoring people who remind you of your group. And because that favoritism feels like connection, you never question it. The bias hides behind the feeling of belonging. And belonging, for most people, is too important to scrutinize. Ambiguity effect. You're choosing between two options. One has clear information. You know the risks, the odds, the trade-offs. The other is ambiguous. The information is vague, incomplete, hard to pin down. Which do you pick? Most people pick the clear one. Not because it's better, because it's known. Ambiguity feels risky. Even when the ambiguous option might be superior, even when the unclear information might hide better outcomes, you avoid it. The discomfort of not knowing outweighs the potential upside. This tendency to avoid options with missing or unclear information is the ambiguity effect. Your mind prefers certainty over possibility, known risks over unknown ones. Even if the known risk is worse, it feels safer. Because you can see it. You can measure it. You can prepare for it. Ambiguity offers none of that. So you stay away. The effect works because your brain is built to predict. Prediction requires information. When information is missing, prediction breaks down. That breakdown feels like danger. So you avoid the ambiguous option, not because it's genuinely riskier, but because you can't assess the risk. The discomfort isn't about the outcome. It's about the process. You can't model it, so you don't choose it. And it shows up everywhere. In investing, people avoid opportunities with unclear payoffs, even when the expected value is higher than safer bets. In decision-making, teams reject innovative ideas because the path isn't clear, even when the innovation could solve problems the safe option can't. The ambiguity creates resistance. The resistance feels like prudence, but it's just discomfort dressed up as caution. The effect also makes you overpay for clarity. You'll accept a worse deal if the terms are spelled out. You'll take a lower salary if the job description is detailed. You'll choose a less effective treatment if the side effects are listed. The clarity makes you feel in control. The control is worth the cost, even when the cost is real and the control is illusory. What makes the ambiguity effect limiting is how it narrows your choices. The world is full of ambiguous opportunities. New ventures, unfamiliar paths, options without guarantees. Avoiding all of them means staying in familiar territory, even when familiar territory isn't working. The ambiguity effect doesn't protect you from risk. It protects you from the discomfort of uncertainty. And that protection costs you every option where the information isn't complete. Perceptual salience. You're in a meeting. One person is sitting directly across from you. Another is off to the side, barely in your peripheral vision. Later, when someone asks who contributed most, you name the person you were facing. Not because they said more, because you saw them more clearly. Or you're watching a conversation between two people. One is facing you. The other has their back turned. When you're asked who was more dominant, who drove the discussion, you picked the one you could see. Their facial expressions registered. Their gestures stood out. The other person was just a silhouette. Visibility shaped your judgment more than actual behavior. This tendency to overweight whatever is most prominent or noticeable is perceptual salience. Your attention gravitates toward what stands out. And what stands out gets treated as more important, more influential, more causal. The salience doesn't reveal significance. It creates it. The pattern works because attention is selective. You can't process everything equally. So your mind prioritizes. Movement draws the eye. Contrast captures focus. Whatever is perceptually salient gets processed more deeply. And deeper processing makes it feel more important. The thing you noticed most becomes the thing you remember most. The thing you remember most becomes the thing you credit most. And it distorts judgment constantly. In group discussions, people who speak louder, gesture more, sit at the head of the table, they get remembered as more influential. Not because they said better things, because they were more visible. The salience made them stand out. Standing out made them seem central. The effect also explains why people overestimate their own role in collaborations. You experience your contributions from the inside. Every thought, every effort, every moment of work. Other people's contributions you observe from the outside. Less vivid, less salient. So your work feels larger, not because it was, because you were paying more attention to it. In conflicts, perceptual salience warps blame. You notice when the other person interrupts you. You don't notice as clearly when you interrupt them. Your interruptions are responses, justified. Theirs are intrusions. The asymmetry isn't in the behavior. It's in what you were attending to. What you noticed felt more significant. What makes perceptual salience tricky is that it feels like accurate observation. You think you're seeing clearly, but you're seeing selectively. Whatever happened to catch your attention got amplified. Whatever didn't stay background. The judgment you're making isn't based on what happened. It's based on what you happened to notice. And what you noticed was determined by where you were looking, what moved, what contrasted, what was loud. None of that has anything to do with actual importance. But it has everything to do with your conclusion.